In this presentation, the novels Beloved and Their Eyes Were Watching God will be compared against each other, along with their respective authors, Toni Morrison and Zora Hurston. This presentation will also discuss how these literary works relate to other pieces of African American literature. To start the analysis of these books off, we will be looking at them through a new historicist view. According to Dr. Michael Delahoyd from Washington State University, New Historicism seeks to find meaning in a text by considering the work within the framework of prevailing ideas and assumptions for its historical era. Basically, New Historicists analyze the politics surrounding a literary work with special attention to the concept of power and how a culture is initiated. They focus on revealing the specific cultural structure reflected in a given work. New historicists seek to prove that history is not only facts, but also a complex description of human reality and evolution of preconceived notions. Literary works offer insights to common prejudices, social taboos, and social organization of that time. African American literature is characterized by a variety of topics including slavery, equality, and racism. In Hurston's and Morrison's works, these topics are largely present. In Their Eyes Were Watching God, Hurston relays a story in which the main character, Janie, lacks a sense of identity, true love, and freedom. However, despite these hardships, Janie never loses hope and continues fighting for a better life. She does this by killing Tea Cake, an event that saves her life while setting her free. Overall, Hurston's story instills in the reader the courage to fight for self-liberation. In Beloved, Morrison explores slavery's creation of spiritual, physical, and emotional suffering in her main protagonist. In her story, she embodies the idea that the best response to hardship is collaboration, rather than the isolation found in Hurston's novel. Overall, Morrison's story details the horrors of American history. African American literature has been prominent since the late 1700s. During this era, African Americans were still suffering from enslavement, and the literature reflected and acknowledged this issue. The literature was also strongly influenced by the African American tradition of oral storytelling. A unique aspect of African American literature was the blatant disregard of grammatical rules. For example, it implemented call-response pattern and meter, as well as rhythm that echoed a dance beat. The literature incorporated common hardships that African Americans experienced during this time, and their journey in overcoming these hardships. The audience of African American literature was originally geared toward the working class, but over time it evolved to encompass all classes of African American society. The early works of African American literature focused on the issue and reality of slavery, as well as the idea of separation of church and state. The literature often was a fugitive slave narrative and went into detail of the injustices done towards slaves. This was used as a tool to fight slavery by spreading the reality behind slavery. The literature also acknowledged white hypocrisy through other texts such as the Bible or the Constitution. Now, the literature following the Civil War was during the period of Reconstruction and focused on a new discrimination that African Americans were struggling with. During this era, African Americans struggled with owning land, as well as the separate and unequal facilities established by the government. A common theme during this time was the idea of perseverance, as literature detailed hardships and obstacles, and how a character overcame this through their journey and development. Now, moving along, African American literature during the Harlem Renaissance focused on poverty and racism and the struggle for equal pay and opportunities. This is when African Americans began challenging white paternalism and racism and began breaking the stereotypes that surrounded their race and culture. African American literature during this time focused on these conflicts of identity and the political role of their culture. Now, during the modernism and black arts era, desegregation began through civil rights movements led by famous leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. Works during this era focused on independence and Africa as a place of origin, known as Afrocentricity. Today, African American literature has evolved greatly. Slave narratives have become part of the American canon, and the literature acknowledges different aspects of African American life. For example, there are now various identities, politically and culturally, for African Americans. The literature also shares the history and diversity of African Americans and acknowledges what they experienced in history and how that correlates to the struggles African Americans still face today. African Americans have prominent historical relevance as the world is exposed to African American culture, especially from gospels and music. There are still countless stories that address the issues of slavery and racism, as well as stories of freedom and independence. Both Hurston's and Morrison's works represent the essential qualities of African American literature. They provide dialogue between characters and the main character's thoughts that are not considered grammatically correct, but represent the slang of the African American culture of their books' respective time periods. In addition, the themes in both books focus on African Americans as a minority, ethnic, and socio-cultural group, including their treatment as subservient. Finally, both novels feature former slaves or low-class African Americans as the main protagonist.